right. Welcome back to the Act Two podcast, a podcast for the real life working screenwriter. I'm Tasha Hugh.
And I am Josh Hallman.
And as a reminder, Act Two is a network and support group for the everyday working screenwriter, of which this podcast is just one of our many initiatives. So thank you for joining us here. Also, please remember to subscribe to the podcast because that allows other writers to find us much easier. Also, giving us a rating, writing a comment, all of that helps us out. But if you'd rather DM us, you can with any questions or topic suggestions. Just want to heckle Josh, that's fine.
Bring it.
You can reach out to us at ActTwoWriters@gmail.com, which is all spelled out, or on our Instagram at ActTwoWriters. I'm also on Instagram at Story Thursday or on Twitter at Tasha 3.0.
And I am on Instagram as Josh Hallman and Joshua Hallman on Twitter.
And today we are talking about film school with a very special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself? I'm very excited.
Me too.
Hi, I'm James Stoteraux, and I'm a writer-producer. Worked on a bunch of genre shows. I just celebrated my 22nd year in the industry.
Holy cow.
Ooh. So I feel super old.
I was just talking to Josh. I guess this was the last episode where, I've been working for 10 years and someone just called me an up-and-comer. So maybe you're an up-and-comer still, James. But James, you're also being very humble. Tell us what you're working on.
So I'm currently working on Batwoman, which has been a great experience. It's sort of a nice homecoming. I worked the showrunner Carol Andrees I'd worked with for several years on Vampire Diaries. Mm-hmm. And so this is my third DC Comics show. Once you work on one, you never escape, apparently. So that's been a blast.
Yeah.
There's clearly just going to constantly a source of comic book shows coming. So that may have been a good career move. But it is interesting how quickly you do get typecast in a way, but not necessarily a bad thing. But it was interesting that when I was going up for, I can't remember which, I think it was Kyle XY, they were like, okay, we don't really see nerd credentials. And so I had to go to ABC Studios and I had a meeting with this exec. And as soon as I walked in, I have a writing partner, Chad Fiveash. And as soon as he walked in, Chad saw the little figurines on the back window and instantly was like, named what special edition. I didn't know what they were, thank God. But literally 30 seconds into the meeting, the executive was like, okay, you passed.
Yeah.
So it actually wasn't that hard to then to branch out into something that we technically didn't have a sample for. Like, I'm a big horror fan, and I've only encountered once where showrunners for a horror show, where the showrunner was like, "Look, I'm not seeing an actual just total horror script." Like I think most people nowadays, I feel like they're just looking for really good voices and writing, and if it's not an exact match, sometimes it sort of allows you to expand the voice of the show in a way.
Yeah. I think so too. I feel like that's a topic for another day because we talk a lot about brands and do you need it? Do you not? How crazy do you go if you do want to do a rom-com? Can you do that even though you're also writing action adventure? So that is a really interesting, especially you. I mean, I feel like you worked on Legend of the Seeker, so we're obviously going to talk about when you're rebooting that for season 2. And you also worked on a Mickey Mouse movie, right?
Yes, which we were supposed to write the sequel to The Emperor's New Groove.
Yes.
And so we would have to go to Disney and watch every couple months. We'd have to watch the new versions, and which was a blast to get to see how it changed and everything. And then when the movie came out, it was a complete bomb. Now it's this beloved cult film, but at the time it was a complete bomb. So they were literally like, well, we're just going to roll your deal over until you have to write this animated short, which was fine. It was a blast. I loved working in animation. I mean, I'm assuming you're enjoying it.
Yeah, I am.
I just love that you can kind of do anything, or not that you can do anything, but you're certainly not bound by the constraints of physical production.
Absolutely. It's great to have the animation company come back and say, we don't know how to do that crazy thing that you just wrote, but we're going to figure out how to do it. And it's not going to cost a lot more money. Great.
And I love from my perspective is that it's like, well, you just draw it.
Yeah,
why
is that another $100,000?
they're like, you don't know what you're doing, do you? And it's like, well, no, I'm not. I'm used to like, well, we have to do it on stage, so it's like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
but it is. I think there is the freedom to do a little bit more is certainly I think very rewarding.
It's probably the equivalent to like when someone says to a writer, just write this scene and just insert,
Yes.
this relationship scene. And you're like, what? This is going to have the
Yeah.
ripple effect on the entire script. But you're like, hey, just draw.
Just draw it.
Draw
Yeah.
something.
We can't just write anything, and they can't just draw anything. It probably is a great equivalent there.
Yeah.
The last thing I'll just say, and then we can move on to the real stuff. But when I saw that you had worked on the Mickey movie, I was like messaged Tosh and I was like, oh, I'm so excited now. Like, I don't know. I didn't know it, but a few years ago, I realized that my dream is to write like a Mickey Mouse, specifically like a Disney movie like that, where it's like a Christmas movie, a Halloween show, something like that. I didn't know it, but maybe because I grew up with it and I just love it so much. So what an honor it is to talk to you right now.
Oh, well, thank you. And they were terrific. I loved work. I think I would have continued doing that if they'd let me. And not that they didn't let me, but I just haven't worked in animation again.
Yeah, that's good to know.
I kind of miss it.
Come on over. Let's go. Let's have a party, James.
Yes.
All right. So we asked James to come talk to us because a couple weeks ago, he had this really interesting and very honest, I thought, Twitter thread that ended up going viral on screenwriting Twitter and continues, it seems, to get a lot of follow-up questions, which is interesting. And it was all about his experience at Columbia's film school, which we will get into in some detail later. Josh and I also went to film school. Our experiences are very different and also very different from yours. And I think we have some very strong opinions about that. So we'll kind of chime in too with what our experiences were. But first, I'd kind of like to just paint a picture of where you came from and kind of start at the beginning. So like, did you know when you started to go to college, you were doing your applications in high school, that you wanted to be a screenwriter?
I knew since I was 6 years old that I wanted to be a filmmaker, but I thought a director. I mean, I think I was a kid who grew up late, born in the 70s, kind of grew up in the 80s. And, every time they had those, like a Star Wars movie come out, they'd have a making of special that were largely about marketing the movie. But as a kid, it was this window, very young age, it was a window into people make them. Like this is somebody's job.
That's the thing I didn't understand at all.
Yeah.
And I grew up an hour from Los Angeles and I still didn't get that.
No, I couldn't understand why when people be like, I want to be a fireman. I'm like, you can make movies, right? Like, if you're not figured that out yet.
I was the exact same way. I'm from Wisconsin. I used to think, I want to make movies. I want to direct movies. I'm going to write movies. I'm going to act in movies. I'm going to produce movies. Like, I just thought it all went together. That's what I thought like the movie industry was. Anyway, I'm sorry. Continue.
No, and it is interesting. I mean, I was super ambitious and actually very specific. I mean, I vividly remember in 5th grade, we had to give a presentation on what we wanted to do as like where we saw ourselves or what we wanted to do. And I announced that I was going to direct the first full-length feature computer animated movie, which I clearly failed. Sorry, Toy Story beat me to it many, many years. But what's funny is I didn't even have a computer at the time. But I was obsessed with Tron, and I understood, that the few minutes that were actually generated by that were CGI that I was obsessed with. So I had this clear vision. Like, I didn't necessarily know how I was going to get there, but I had a very clear vision of what I wanted to do.
Interesting.
But at the same time, I mean, so I grew up, we moved around a little bit, but largely grew up in very rural Southern Maryland. There were 7 kids in my graduating class, including myself and the foreign exchange student we got at the very last second. And yeah, my parents ran the local gas station. So there was no sort of path that somebody could help me say, oh, this is how you do it. And I think so largely out of that, it became this reverse engineering from, directors that I liked, Spielberg, Lucas, Zemeckis, James Cameron. And so you start trying to do as much research as possible. And well, how did they do it? So maybe I can, University of Southern California film school came up a lot in those conversations. And so it was like, okay, so you can go to film school. Okay, that makes sense. Like, lawyers go to law school, doctors go to medical school, filmmakers go to film school. So that path made it seemed like a path that actually was logical and clearly did work for for a lot of the people I liked. I mean, I was also aware that like James Cameron was a truck driver, but it was like, okay, I could go to film school or I could drive a truck. The film school seemed like more fun, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. That's a path that makes more sense. Yeah. That's interesting. I would say I did not like Josh, I think had the same experience as you, like wanting to be a filmmaker early. I did not. I did not know you could write movies until I was in my 20s, like in college. And then I was like, oh, that's a job. I'm going to try and do that. And then I couldn't do that because the school I happened to go to was this small all women's liberal arts school up in Oakland. And like all they had were video classes. So like, and I'm very curious kind of what your college experience was like in terms of the classes, because for me, the classes were like the A+ student, her project was a banana that she put in the microwave and filmed exploding. And I did a narrative and everyone was like, oh, Tasha, like a narrative. That's so homely. But oh, the banana. So that was my experience and then I was like, okay, I should probably go get a real film education. And then I went to Boston University to get my MFA in screenwriting, which was as we'll talk about, a huge waste of time. But it was really interesting to finally study filmmakers, which I didn't get to do in that like, weird liberal arts education. But even then was still like, I don't know how this is a job. I was going to write novels. That's what I was going to do. And in my experience anyways, they did not then teach you how to turn it into a job. They just taught the art of it. So, which kind of leads into the next question, which is, it seems like you had your head on straight. You knew you wanted to be a filmmaker of some kind. So then when you entered college, what did you think you needed to do, I guess, to get into the film industry? And what did you think life would look like in the film industry when you were in that college stage, freshman college stage?
I understood the industry was the odds were stacked against me. So I feel like I was trying to sort of spread my risk. So for college, I was very much committed to, okay, I'm just going to get an undergraduate degree in something else while still taking film classes. So the thought was, okay, I could maybe like be an English teacher or something. So I majored in English, but I did take classes. But the notion was that I would go to grad school for the real hands-on sort of thing. But at the same time, while in college, but I also want to prepare myself for that. So going to school, so I went to Columbia undergrad, which was an amazing experience. And it was also in New York City. So I could volunteer on student films, low budget films. And it was an environment where you could show up the first day as a PA on a no budget movie. And by day 5, because half the crew has quit, either because they haven't been paid or they've got a paying gig. So by like day 5, you're the electrician. And so I learned things like how to tap into the electrical system of street lamps, so we could shoot.
Let's talk later after this.
So I know it's a really good skill. But because I very much sort of tried to say, okay, I need to learn other things that I can bring to the film industry. I was at least somewhat mindful of the fact that I wanted the education to be as broad as possible. The thought was, okay, if I also do really well as an undergrad, then that will help me get into a place like USC for grad school, which it doesn't actually matter. I mean, I think that was a big mistake. That it in some ways I could have done one-stop shopping by just doing it all as an undergrad. Although I don't know if Columbia, I think even though I had a film major, I don't think it was very production based. I think it was closer to your experience with the banana. I took a lot of those classes, but I don't think it was actually the mechanics of filmmaking.
So did you then study English because you literally wanted to just have a backup, or because you thought that was stacking the deck for you for success to then become a filmmaker? You thought that was the path?
I think a little bit of both. I think it was the kind of risk management of it opened up options. So if this didn't work out, I at least had on my resume that it said something other than film. But I think it was also a knowledge of or recognition that you needed something to say. And so I took a ton of random classes. I took classes in Russian literature. I tried to get as broad of an education as possible. So when it was getting time to making movies, that I was bringing something to the table.
Yeah.
And did you have the urge to move to Los Angeles, or was there that need or feel? Because I'm always curious, and I talk to people who are on the East Coast. Now it's obviously different with technology and everything. But were you feeling like I need to be in LA? Like I need to get out west?
I did, but it was also terrifying. Like the people, like
Mhm.
I did, I think on some level recognize that I could just pack my car and drive out to Los Angeles where I know no one. But that on and people that do that I'm so in awe of because that seems like the most terrifying thing ever. I did. It's interesting. I looked at USC for undergrad, and I think Los Angeles. I knew ultimately that's where I would be, but it felt a little scary in this small little town. Although the idea of I don't know if New York is any
Yeah.
less
Yeah.
intimidating, but I think in retrospect, looking back, I wanted as much knowledge going in before I had to do that
Mm,
truly terrifying leap. But my plan was for grad school. I think my plan was for grad school was USC. USC was my first choice.
mhm,
Um, and what was interesting applying to grad school, I applied to 5 programs, and the two most selective were Columbia and USC, and they were the only two I got into.
Oh.
So my first choice was USC, but Columbia allowed because I was an undergrad, they allowed me to work as a residence hall director, which gave me free housing for grad school, gave me an $8,000 stipend. So it
mm.
was a little bit more of a better financial arrangement. And when I called USC, because that's where I really wanted to go, I basically said, Columbia's doing this for me. Could we maybe do something similar?
Yeah.
What can you do? And the person answering the phone said, we will let you put the world's greatest film school on your resume.
No.
And
Whoa.
and so I couldn't argue with that. I mean, in some ways, I was sort of impressed, but
The confidence.
I know. I was like, okay. So, but I simply, it was doing a numbers game. And I think also at this point, I was very comfortable. And so I used the
Mhm,
excuse. So I also, and I don't think this was an excuse, but I thought this was well said. My sensibility is much more USC. Like I'm a total, like in terms of Spielberg, Luke. I mean, that's my kind of sensibility. So at the time, this was the mid 90s, independent films were taking off. And so in Columbia is much more geared towards that. And
mm,
so I think what I sort of thought also as a strategy was, okay, I'm going to take my mainstream big blockbuster Hollywood sensibility, but I'm going to attempt to get an indie,
mm.
smaller, character-based education. So then it's like maybe this will be the perfect combination.
Yeah, and that actually kind of calls back to something you said earlier, which I think is really important, is that you were trying to get sort of a fuller education rather than just a film school education, because so much of what we hear, I think, in our business is producers or buyers are just more curious by the voices of people who have lived a life versus people who have just done film school and that's it. And of course, those people tend to, not always, of course, but tend to just have inject more life experience in what they're writing, and it just seems to come alive on the page. And so, I do think what is then very interesting is that you built your life to be that way specifically, and then on top of that, then decided, okay, I'm going to take this, the Spielberg mentality and bring it to the small. So you're just constantly trying to pull from all these different places, which is so great because just as a sort of FYI to other people who are considering film school, just a film school path, if you graduate film school and go straight to the industry, some people think that's not that interesting. Actually, they're definitely not impressed by film school
Mhm.
just in general, but they're more impressed if you've, like I worked at a homeless shelter for a long time, and I bring that up in meetings and people are like, oh my god, tell me about that, who cares about film school?
Yes, I think because also, and I don't know if maybe it's because so many people did go to films. It's like the ones that went to film school, they don't need to hear more about it.
Yeah.
And the ones that didn't go to film school, probably it's because they didn't make that choice, and so
Mhm.
they don't need to hear about it, and they're much more interested in your experience at a homeless shelter. I mean,
Yeah,
that will be, you will stand out a lot more than even having the world's greatest film school on your resume.
totally agree.
I mean, it's interesting that I mean, I love your framing of that because I do think that's true about the trying to grab different things, and I'm now going to steal that when people ask why, because I think it makes me sound so much smarter. But ultimately, the end result was it was just money too. It was the
Hmm.
Yeah.
resources I had, and I think it probably worked. It just worked out that way too. That was maybe also somewhat a little bit of a smarter, or at least there was a philosophy behind it. But ultimately, it came down. It was just the money.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that worked out for you in some ways because I bet that gave you a more varied education than you might have got at the best film school ever. But I am very curious in terms of just like really getting down to sort of the nitty gritty of what you thought you needed in order to get into the film industry? Because when I started film school, it was a completely blank slate for me. I had no idea what I needed to do practically. What sort of job, like entry level jobs were there? Did I need to get? What skills did I need to hone besides just learning about film? I knew nothing about what the job market looked like out there. So when you entered grad school, it sounds like you knew so much more than I did at all of these stages about the film industry. But what did you feel like you needed to know to get into the film industry after you graduated?
Being a kid that grew up with movies, the answer to all of life's questions can be found in movies. And so what my whole knowledge of what needed to happen came from this movie called The Big Picture, which is this Kevin Bacon movie starring Kevin Bacon. It was written and directed by Christopher Guest. And it was a satire of film school and the film, leaving film school in the film industry. But even though I recognize it was a satire, it did provide a sort of path, which was that ultimately, you needed to learn what you're doing, but you needed a great calling card. And so most of most of the things it becomes, it's a short film or a great script. And so while I recognize that you can learn a lot from watching movies, but at the same time, the actual level of craft was something that I felt like there was gaps that you didn't really know. And that I do think that what film school appeals to people is people that recognizes that they do have things they need to learn. But the ultimate thing I think was thinking what this program hopefully would get me was that all of those different skill sets would culminate in having this great sample to take to the industry, and would, hopefully, and I thought at the time this is the way it worked, was like an agent would see it and then sign you, and then they would send you out, and before you knew it, you had a 3-picture deal with 20th Century Fox.
Naturally.
So my whole focus was really on it was all about directing. I was not considering writing at all. I knew that was certainly a path, but I felt more confident as a visual storyteller than writing felt hard.
Writing is hard.
Directing actors was the one thing I didn't quite have a ton of experience for, because as I was making little films as a kid and forcing the neighborhood kids, I recognized that there was acting limitations that getting a performance. So that was another aspect where I sort of, as wanting to be a director, was like, okay, let me actually working with people that want to be actors. And I think that so that was definitely a skill set for me that I felt was lacking, and I was hoping to fill in. And the nice thing about, I don't know with your experience, but at least at Columbia, you're forced to do all the different disciplines, at least as far as directing, writing. They even force you to do acting. That was one of the things I thought was unexpectedly one of the most valuable things, was that it taught you to respect the craft. And it was largely, you spent a semester humiliating yourself.
That's exactly how I felt. It was the most anxiety ridden I've ever been in my entire life, is having to go to that class every, couple days. Oh my gosh.
Which if you got nothing out of it, it was to just understand how vulnerable actors are making themselves, and to appreciate that that there's a sensitivity involved. So I thought that was very valuable.
There was something that I took away from like actors and acting, like those classes, where it was like, where did your character just come from? What are they doing when they come in? And, what do they want? And that was always kind of like the character work that then obviously translates into writing. But that was like an acting thing that kind of always stuck in my head, that actors always do. And I was like, yeah.
I feel like your experience with acting class was much kinder than mine, because that's nice and valuable. Like mine, our teacher made us do scenes from Sex, Lies, and Videotape, so they were just all like, just so humiliating. And I was also like, just like, that's not who I am, right? Like I'm not publicly that way in any way. And so like to have to just completely strip down, not literally, but very emotionally, and have to have these kind of like sex type scenes with people was horrifying. But I think he did that on purpose, because he wanted us to do exactly what you're talking about, James, is just completely realize how vulnerable and scary it is to be an actor.
I think there are so many actors that turn out to be great writers because they're thinking of all the things you just outlined in a deeper way that sometimes I think from a writer's standpoint, we know what we want to happen. And we don't always necessarily put ourselves into, let me put my yourself in the position of this character, and what would they do? What do they want? And I think that that's, I often tell actors, it's like that is the best training for writing in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I do that actually, I do think in a weird way, the acting classes actually did help ultimately with the writing.
Yeah.
What are the odds that you're going to sign up for an acting class after this podcast, Tasha?
Very low, very, very low. I'm curious, Josh, did you have a similar experience when you were going through film school, as James is talking about, of like you knew you needed a short film, like you had your eye on the prize? Because I feel like you talked about you just wanting to do everything when you came out here.
Yeah, I'm also from a small town, and I love big movies, blockbusters, Spielberg, Lucas, everything you just said. You were speaking to my soul. So when I was going to school, I just knew I wanted to move to Los Angeles, and I was like, when I get to LA, I'm gonna figure it out. Like that was always my plan. I was like, I'm just gonna get there and figure it out. I'm from Wisconsin. This shit doesn't. I'm out of here. And so I didn't. Yeah, just to be totally honest, I was a little more like, I was just having maybe a little too much fun throughout school. And I was just like, I'm going to move from here one day. And then I was like looking forward to that day. And I got out. I don't even remember what your question
And
was,
you're
Tasha. I kind of
so you were just
out.
your plan was to land in LA and then just make movies. That's it.
Yeah. I always looked at moving to Los Angeles as like my second college. Like I knew I was like, I need to, this isn't where I'm supposed to be, because I wasn't really learning anything my first year, second year. And I was just kind of like, I got to move. I got to get out of here.
Did you know anyone?
When I moved out to LA?
No, before moving. Did you?
I did not.
Wow. See, that's that level of insane courage.
Yeah.
Let me take that back. I had a friend's family who lived in Newport Beach, and I moved out to them, and they were like, you can work at our furniture store. I was like, sweet. And then I had to move. And then ironically, I met someone when I drove into LA, like, this sounds like so shady. This is a story for another day, but like at a party, and I ended up staying with them for a little bit. And then one thing led to another, and then got contacted with an old family friend who I hadn't seen, but was friends with my mom. So that's how I got out here. And then I just started to
I didn't know any of that, and I've known you for 10 years. I didn't know you worked at a furniture store.
Oh, I sold furniture for one summer. It's freaking awesome. So, yeah, I was a little scattered in my decision making.
But I do think, there is something to be said for that. And I think I do honestly think, if I analyze my choices in some ways, it was trying to avoid that scary moment that ultimately I was going to have to do anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
In some ways it'd be better to have gotten to that place faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get into your Twitter thread now, because I think
the meat. Let's go. The thing that set everything off.
Because it is interesting, because in your thread you tell us the whole story of how you ultimately made it to Los Angeles and kind of were getting there. So do you want to just talk about where the thread came from, what kind of prompted you to do it, and then kind of tell the story of what you told there, which is riveting.
Yes, although the irony is, my advice to so many writers is don't tweet. So it's funny that there was a Wall Street Journal article that they're doing a whole series on student loan debt, and because now they finally have been able to sort of publish, I don't know, wherever they've gotten access to seeing the debt held by people leaving programs, and also compare that to their ability to repay based on their starting salaries. And so they chose Columbia because the Columbia MFA program that encompasses the whole School of the Arts, not just the film school, but had a shockingly high median debt burden, along with a very, very low ability to repay within like the salaries that the students were making within 2 years. And so I read this article over lunch and I became actually physically ill, because I could I know that, the way inflation works and everything, but it didn't occur to me that the program was like $70,000 now a year. And so that was resulting in students having like $300,000 worth of debt. And I think the reason it made me ill was because I could see the sliding doors moment where that could have been me. Because I'd went a long time ago, it wouldn't have been $300,000 worth of debt, but I could project myself into that reality, given the fact that, as I mentioned, there were 55 of us who started, and there's only 4 of us that are actually doing what we sort of set out to do. and realizing that 97% or 93% of the people who were in that program were ultimately having some level of that debt burden, unless they came from extraordinary wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of that's what I'd sort of had been feeling for the last 25 years when people ask, like, should you go to film? That's the big question you constantly get asked. And so I was looking at least my own program and feeling like, wow, the odds were terrible. And in fact, actually, one of the things that I added later to the thread was that one of the guys in the program who wasn't successful in the film industry won the lottery. And it's a weird thing when you look at the odds that we have the same number of working directors as we do Powerball winners. And so I know statistics don't quite work that way, but I felt like if people were spending all this money, the odds should be better than a lottery ticket.
Yeah.
And so out of that, that's what sort of prompted me to
Yeah.
fire up the Twitter machine.
You know what's so
Yeah.
interesting, by the way, about what you're saying is that I feel like any other kind of discipline, that would be horrifying. Like, that school would shut down. But I feel like in our business, it's like, well, the blame is put on you. If you weren't able to make it in the industry, that's your fault. Which, why? You're right. Like, they should be preparing you for a job in the industry. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, and the students that were the focus of that article were also getting a lot of exactly what you're saying. They were getting a lot of hate online. So that also bothered me too, because it was sort of like, I also wanted to kind of at least give a little bit of context for what that they were in some ways victim. While they may have, you should have probably known you were going to be $30,000 or $300,000 in debt. I don't think that was made clear in many ways, and that you look at the glossy brochure and they tout a lot of great people, and you assume you're going to be one of them.
Yeah.
And so again, I did not actually envision this would go viral in any way. I thought, I mean, everything I wrote about in that thread, my sort of friends know. I've talked to it's sort of one of those funny stories. But I did feel like I wanted to add context because the article was so focused on numbers, and to sort of maybe talk about what I thought were some of the problems of why those students got in the position that they did, and why the program was not maybe as successful as it should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's one of those things when I did get to the program, I mean, I found that so many of the teachers were also just these desperate people also trying to break into the film industry in a way that was sort of like, well, maybe that's not, they could be great teachers. And I don't want to sort of rag on saying just because they didn't have practical experience, but it was one of those things where IMDb had just started as I was in the middle. So you could actually look up what your instructors had done, and when it's nothing, you were sort of like, wait a minute. And so I did have, there were some good like I had a guy named David Shaber who wrote The Warriors and did a lot of big 70s films, and he was largely retired. And I felt like that one class, if I could just give all my tuition to him, that would probably be what was that was sort of a success, because I think he taught craft, not just giving opinion. I felt like many of the faculty members it was almost like they were treating it like a feedback session, which maybe you could get great feedback on your script, but that doesn't necessarily help you for the next one. Whereas this guy, David Shaber, really just sort of nuts and bolts, and it didn't matter whether you're writing a slasher film or you're writing some period epic. Like, he was giving you a set of tools, and you could build any kind of house you wanted, but these were the tools to do it. And so that was something I recognized very early on in the program, was that it was like, oh, I don't see the path forward. And they were very much like, don't worry about that. Don't focus on the industry. Whereas I was at least, well, how do we not focus on it?
Yeah. So did you have any classes that were industry related, or were they all study films in really interesting, bizarre ways, and that's it? What can you kind of talk about what your classes were like for film school there?
There mostly there was like theory criticism, so where you did watch movies. Although most of those classes I literally took as an undergrad, so that was another weird experience to get my schedule and say, by the way, I got an A in all of these classes.
Yeah.
Give me something else. I probably should have just turned the papers back in. But then you did take classes in writing, classes in directing, and then classes in acting. And I think there was one business of film class, but it was focused on like marketing.
Yeah.
Which is not necessarily, I mean, that I think that's fine, but there was nothing that sort of said like, oh, here's how you're going to, this is what you transition to. And so one of the things I mentioned in the thread was that what the program sort of geared you towards was the idea of they had a big festival at the end of the year. And again, this actually tracked with my thought of, okay, you make a calling card. And so it wasn't till I got to the end of the year and saw the festival, and you see the films that people are making and that how much money they were spending. And as I mentioned, like this one film was this World War II epic that had a tank, and it was shot in Europe. It was shot in Polish, and I'm sitting in the theater thinking, I don't have, whatever $60,000 this thing cost. I've never been to Europe. I don't speak Polish. Like I don't know how one replicates this. And so I sat there realizing like I am so screwed. And so in that moment, I instantly was like, I can't afford to do this. I can afford paper. So I'm going to write. And something I didn't mention though, but that I sort of became acutely aware of is, so that person who made that film, it ended up winning the festival. It ended up winning the Student Academy Award. So in some ways, so that's like they hit the brass ring, the silver ring, the gold, like they got them all. And to date, the only professional credit, they directed an episode of Law and Order, and which wouldn't even pay for so it's one of those things where it was like, I'm looking at this program and saying, even if you succeed beyond everyone else in the program, it does not still result in an actual career.
Yeah.
And so out of that, that's when it was like switch to whatever the next plan is. And so that became,
you hit the emergency button.
It was like, I better take these writing classes. I'm now my focus is I need to be a writer. And so I, again, sort of the process of trying to reverse engineer people I looked up to. So like Chris Columbus was a writer that wrote Gremlins, then directed Home Alone. So it's like, okay, that's going to be my path. I'm going to write a script. This was kind of the heyday of the big spec sales, where every week a spec script would sell for $1 million. So in many ways, my plan was do that, sell a script for $1 million, and then then I can pour some of that money actually into a student film. I'm not going to do a World War II epic. I'm going to do a World War III epic. I'm going to show you. And so that became weirdly the terrible plan of, write a script to sell it. And I had a friend who then became my writing partner. And so, we were like, just write the most commercial thing you can think of. And at the time, Scream had just come out, and we knew we couldn't replicate that success. Like we were, this is all terrible advice, by the way. We knew,
no, this is great,
but we were smart enough to know, don't replicate that. Like, don't that wave we are behind. So we thought, what's the next wave? And so we sort of correctly guessed the teen sex comedy. We were like, whatever 80s genre can we bring back in a smart, sophisticated way? So we decided to write a postmodern spring break movie that was sort of raunchy, but funny and smart and not sexist. And so that's what we did. And so we thought we could enter it like in the screenwriting festival. And I think largely, I don't blame them. I mean, it was a spring break script. I don't think any Columbia professor was going to champion. I seriously don't blame them for being like, pass. But we were stuck with a script. Like, so this was literally the plan. It was, okay, we have to sell this, but we had no idea. The program didn't provide any way for what we were supposed to do. So I happened to be randomly in Los Angeles for a week. I didn't know anyone my age. And there was a person that I randomly had met like 8 months before, who was an assistant. I didn't even know him that well, but uncharacteristically, and it wasn't even, I think it was out of boredom, but it was very uncharacteristically, I decided to call him up and just like say if he wanted to get drinks. And per your suggestion from the previous episode about maintaining contacts, this is an example of why that is stunning advice.
Wow.
So I call him up. He's like, yeah, sure, let's get drinks. And that night, while getting ready, my writing partner calls me and says, hey, I've been researching producers who I think would be good for this script. He's like, there's this guy, Neil Moritz, who's now the Fast and the Furious guy, but before he was making like teen comedies. And so so my writing partner was like, well, I think we should get Neil Moritz. And I very sarcastically said, well, I know one person in this town and their name isn't Neil Moritz. So that's not going to happen. I meet this guy for drinks, this guy, Justin Rosenblatt. And so I'm like, hey, so what are you doing? He'd switched jobs. And he says, oh, I'm an assistant for a producer at Neil Moritz's company. And I laugh.
Holy shit.
I laugh because I'm like, this is so funny. And I tell him what happened. And he's like, well, I guess I got to read the script now. And it was one of those things like, if we had just met, I never would have had the courage to. And also, I think it would have been bad form. It would have been bad manners to him, because then he would have thought like, oh, I was just using, and I wasn't. I literally was whatever. And so when he immediately said he'd read the script, I was instantly like, no, I was not that. I wasn't fishing. But he's like, no, then he wanted the script because I wouldn't give it to him, and I gave it to him. And that Sunday he called me and said, who has this? And I was like, you. And he's like, do not give this to anyone. And I was like, is it that bad? And he was like, no, I love it. I'm going to pitch it at tomorrow's staff meeting.
Oh shit.
So the thing is, this Sunday wasn't any Sunday. This was Academy Awards Sunday. The reason I'm telling you a story is because I want to lay out the insane amount of luck that is nearly impossible to replicate in a way. But so this was the Academy Awards for the 98 Academy Awards. And so if it hadn't been that Sunday, everything would have ended, because my friend's boss read this. When she eventually read the script, she did not like it. And so everything would have ended there. But because she'd been out partying a little bit too hard for the Academy Awards, she did not show up to that Monday morning staff meeting. So when her assistant pitched the script, Neil Moritz was like, oh, who would be good for that? So it passed to this other producer, Brad Luff, who was more of a kind of guy, like it felt like the sensibility match.
Yeah, I know Brad, definitely.
He's great. Like, he's so great. So he's like, sure, I'll take it. Takes it, puts it on his desk. I don't think at this point he had even read it, but across town. So this is now like the fifth insane coincidence. Across town, Michael Nathanson, the head of MGM, decides he wants to make a Spring Break movie. So all of his execs sort of called the producers they work with. So Brad Luff gets a phone call from this exec saying, Michael wants to make a Spring Break movie. And Brad's like, I have one. So he just sent it over. And at this point, I could be wrong, but I actually don't think he read it, because he read it. He liked it. He didn't love it, is my recollection. Like, I mean, not that he basically thought it needed work. And he's probably right. But he read it, gave me a bunch of notes. Meanwhile, the other producers now like mad at the assistant for, why did you give this project away? So she is now also giving notes, and she doesn't like it as much. So the notes are really extensive. And so my writing partner are very confused as to what we're supposed to do. We have no, essentially all of it's going to just collapse. And then in the middle of it, MGM calls and says, we want to buy it. We love it. We want to make it. So Brad, to his credit, was like, don't do those notes. Brad was like, forget everything we said. Like, let's hear MGM's notes.
Wow.
And so it's one of those things where then it's like, you can't replicate. You just can't replicate that. And the interesting thing too is, just to bring it all back around, was they wanted to attach they hired a director, and they hired this guy who had just graduated from AFI, who had this hot film, and it was sort of like the director was sort of what I envisioned I was supposed to be in this relationship.
Yeah.
But I think he was fielding a lot of offers. And I honestly, if my suspicion was he didn't want to jumpstart his career with the Spring Break movie, which again, understandable.
Sure.
So they paid him a ton of money. He was like, I'm going to rewrite the script. He took a year. By that time he handed it in. I think they forced him to hand it in. And it felt like it was pretty clear he wrote it at the last second just to hand it in and honor the deal. And by that point there was a regime change, so it never got made. But we were working writers.
100%. That's like, you achieved the dream. Like, people always say, I'm just going to become a screenwriter and sell my $1 million script. And no, that's never going to happen to you. But it happened to you, James. You're like a unicorn.
Yeah, you are a unicorn. Tasha and I, we just talked about this yesterday, actually, about what people perceive as luck and good fortune. And we were talking about how, you look back on certain, not just you, but people, you look back on these wins in your career and you're like, whoa, if that person wasn't driving through Los Angeles on that exact day at this exact time, I wouldn't have had this meeting and I wouldn't have sold that. And it's just so crazy how these things work.
In our industry specifically.
Yeah, it really is.
It's terrifying. I mean, I honestly, and I'm not kidding, it keeps me up at night, where I think of all the pivot points where it all could have gone wrong. I mean, like me calling a person I'm incredibly shy, and like, that is so insane to me that I did that. Or just what if we decide to resurrect the Ninja movie? like instead, like all the little things that needed
Yeah.
to fall into place. And so that's where I think with reading that article, I could see all these people that I went to school with. It's like they just didn't have the weird lucky thing. Like, I mean, I went to school with some
Mhm.
incredibly talented people, and they didn't have that weird fluke. And I had like 7 of them in a row.
Mm.
Mm.
I'm even right down to with then that was literally the only feature we've ever sold. And it turns out that Neil Moritz's company had just sold a TV project, and the writer had to back out. And they were like, "Would you guys be interested?" And we were like, "What is it?" And they said they want Switchblade sisters, but we're not quite sure what that means. And so my writing partner immediately was like, "You mean the Jack Hill girl gang exploitation movie from the '70s? I have the special edition Laserdisc if you'd like to watch it." And so they immediately were like, "Yes, you're our guys."
Yeah.
And that's how we sort of fell into TV. I mean, it was never, and then it's like suddenly like 22 years later, it's
That's
like
insane.
we're still working in TV. But the funny thing out of all of this, because that weird detour, I just was one class short in getting my degree.
Well, then let's talk about that because I assume, all right, James, you've gone and done the dream. You've done what we have been training you to do. You've just sold a screenplay. How did Columbia receive this news while you're still in school?
They were not impressed
What?
at
Were they
all.
jealous? So they had to be a little jealous of this, right?
I think yes, some people, because I think that Chad and I don't think people weren't. I think people were very skeptical or sort of dismissive because we were, it's like we wanted to make Raiders of the Lost Ark. But even
Yes.
among the faculty, it was a little bit of like there was this just sense of, well, you're not going to finish the program, and it was like, no. Why? I mean, I recognize at
Mhm.
this point no one, and I even think I recognized way before that no one like looks at your diploma. Like nobody cares. I
Yeah.
was very much aware of it. I think at this point the only reason I wanted that degree was really for my parents and the
Mhm.
fact that I had spent money on it, so it was sort of more the completest thing. And because my writing partner was in the same position, except he took that class, so he just had to turn in something as his thesis, and so they were very accommodating as far as him. But it was the fact that it was a class where I was supposed to sit around a table
Mm.
that they were unwilling to overlook that.
And you were already living in LA at this point, so you couldn't even go to classes, is what you're saying.
I was spending the summer in Los Angeles, but I still had an apartment I was subletting. So technically, I was the plan actually when we packed up the U-Haul to move out was I stopped at the school and said, "Here's what happened. Can we figure out some way that I could do this through correspondence?" And the head of the film school at the time he was actually reasonable. I think his attitude was kind of like, "You did good, kid, but we
Yeah.
can't just ethically it would be wrong. It would be like if you were in law school and suddenly somebody hired you to be a lawyer. Okay, fine, we just give you a degree."
Mhm.
Yeah. I just wanna say, I always think about what it would be like to be in school, going back to school and being like, "Hey, guys, I just sold a script. What are you guys doing for lunch today?" And you're, like, in college. Like, that idea, we've talked about it with, like, I think Simon Kinberg, J.J. Abrams, and now you, and I've always wondered, "Damn, I wonder what that was like." And so it's just so crazy to hear.
Well, apparently nothing happened. Apparently it
Yeah.
was no big deal to
Yep.
everyone in Columbia.
What the funny thing is that I had like a going away dinner and with like people and so people like that my close friends were obviously very happy or whatever, and then there was one guy who happened to be there, and so I was explaining, and he was in the playwriting program, and it was sort of this awkward, like he clearly was sort of, this was frustrating to me. We were sort of not, I want to say frenemies, but I don't think we got
Mhm.
along very well. And so I think that my success really was annoying to him. But I was talking to him and he was whatever, and he made the comment, he said, "Well, I should just switch to screenwriting because I mean I guess it's so easy to sell a
It's so
script."
much easier, yeah.
And it was such a dig that I was like,
Yeah.
"Screw you." Cut to
Yeah.
3 years later, he did do that. So so the joke's on me.
Yeah, screw you, James.
I know. It was one of those things. I was like, okay, my hat's off. You did, but yeah. So it's one
Yeah.
of those things where I just looked at it like, I mean, honestly, my parents would occasionally bring it up, like, "You're really not going to get the degree." Somewhat just because it felt like you were so close, and so I didn't
Yeah.
really care.
Yeah.
But then working as a writer, you start careers progressing, and because Columbia had a thing where they did the festival in New York and they also did a version out in Los Angeles, and so they would bring out the people, the students in the festival, And so they would try and kind of make since they flew out, to make it worth their while. And so they'd have panels. And so some of the, I can't remember, some of the coordinators, or even one of the, I can't remember exactly who, whatever, had reached out and said, hey, would you mind being on one of these panels? And so I did this a couple times, and I was always very gracious, because I think deep down inside, I understood I can at least provide the information about the industry that it's too late in some ways, but that I felt an obligation to basically try and give whatever advice I could. So I tried to be as generous with that as possible. And then it was like the third time where there was a mix up where they introduced me as my year. And it was like, I felt like I sort of went with it, but then I felt weird, and it felt like, and so I just mentioned, by the way, I actually didn't graduate. And also I didn't know whether I was supposed to mention, by the way, I dropped out. Like, is that, which I feel like actually in retrospect, I should have sort of as a, like, and I felt like the program probably should have been okay with that. But so it was actually one of the coordinators that was like, well, let's actually see if we can seal the deal and just get you your degree, so this doesn't become a weird thing. And so then he put me in touch with the current chair of the film school. And so we talked on the phone, and he seemed really enthusiastic. So it was like, this was like great. And the thing is, what I understood that what we needed, the ask was that I had to register for that class. But if I registered for that class as like a full-time student, it would be like $20,000. What we were trying to do was get it so you're, at least in the program, is your first 2 years you pay full tuition for, while you're working your thesis, you pay this like $900 research arts fee. And so the thing we were basically was like, just pay the research arts fee. And we'll do what he proposed was, you'll do an independent study with me. And so I was like, great. And then he insisted that, well, I had to come out to meet him face to face. And so I thought that and he was saying he was very busy with the festival. And so it was one of those things where I was like, oh, and it was in the middle of, this is early May. So this is the middle of staffing season. And Legend of the Seeker had just been canceled.
Sadness. Pour one out.
So I was looking for a job, and the last thing you want to be doing is in the middle of staffing season. I mean, sometimes you get meetings like the last minute, and to fly back to New York potentially timing was not great.
Yeah.
And so I was like, yeah, so this isn't a great time, but maybe like I tried to like push it. I was like, because it was like, what's the rush? It had now been many, many, many years. So, but he sort of very kind of abruptly was like, I'm doing you a favor. And so I was like, oh, I felt very chastised.
Yeah.
At the same time, in my brain, it's like, you're saying you're really busy, but this is kind of can this just be an email?
Right.
And so I fly out. It was a red eye. I paid a fortune for this red eye. I was exhausted. I couldn't sleep. And I show up to the meeting, and then he starts pitching me a television pilot.
I love this.
Because I was exhausted, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, and you're trying to nod. And, yeah, I try and also be a polite audience and whatever. And so you're just thinking this is this is some weird segue, or it's like, and I'm sure, everyone's sort of used to having friends pitch you their great idea, but it's slowly one of those things where now, as this is going on and on and on, you're sort of, it's like your mind is putting together all the pieces about, yeah, you want someone in person so you can hear a pitch. Oh, independent study with me. And so, in the pitch was a procedural. Yeah, it was, the whole thing was like kind of an out of body experience.
I love hearing this though. I love this. I love all this.
But you go from the cringe of hearing this pitch to then the cringe of wondering where this is all going. And because it's also one of these things that I had never worked in a procedural. Like it was one of those things where, and he made a comment about something like, it'd be really great if we could help each other out. And so in that moment, it wasn't that I sort of was thinking this is what's happening, but it was also one of those things where I didn't just very nicely, like, I think I even made a comment about, like, the last show I worked on had wizards. Like it's not like no one would be interested in a procedural for me at that point. Like I think all the shows I'd worked on were sort of much more younger. Like it was one of those things, like, even if I wanted to help, I wouldn't be helpful. In some ways, I would actually be like somehow attaching me. Like I didn't even know how I wanted to go about this. And so I kind of was trying to explain that.
But did he, like, how clear was he so he pitched this thing in the meeting, and then what was the proposition? Was he very open about it, or was he just like wink, wink, nod, nod?
It was more of, it was the only real spoken thing was the kind of the let's help each other out here. And so it was not an explicit demand in that moment. But when I then tried to kind of just say that that I'm very sorry, like your pitch sounds great. I don't even, it's one of those, like, you're just being polite at that point, but also to say, I'm sorry, I actually can't help you. And I mean that actually not in a way that I wouldn't try and help you, but in a way that I actually don't have the ability to deliver on that. And then the whole meeting just ended at that point. And that's where it was sort of like, okay. So I walked out of that meeting and called literally every person I've ever met. Immediately was like, am I reading this? Was this supposed to be a weird quid pro quo? Most of the people I talked to, but I described what happened, was like, yes. And so I still clung to the fact of, well, maybe there's a way. Because it was one of those things, the sunk cost fallacy. Like, I came all the way out here. And so on the advice of a couple of friends, they were like, just reach back out. Just basically say it was a great meeting. And let's work out how we can, let's work out how I can get my degree. Like, don't mention the pilot, and see, like, give him the space to not ever mention it again.
Yeah.
Then the kind of correspondence ended, and he referred me to an administrator assistant who said, oh yeah, we can take this, we can take care of this. And so I'm like, oh, thank God. Okay, great. Like, the awkwardness is done. This is fine. And then the next thing I know, they had signed me up for a full semester of tuition.
Jesus Christ.
Which was never part of what was discussed. I found out only because I got a late notice for late fees on top. So it also felt additionally punitive. Like, it was one of those things, like, nobody, if this wasn't what I thought it was, like, trying to be charitable, if it wasn't what I thought it was, well, shouldn't then there been an offer of what this independent study was supposed to look like? Like, nobody even, I mean, at this point, because I was billed for those classes, I literally could have taken a bunch of classes for the fall semester, and nobody even told me. And so I didn't even show up for any of this. And so at that point, that's when I was like, oh, it's exactly what I suspected it was. And at that point, then because I'd gone there as an undergrad, I knew where some of the levers I knew some of the resources to go to. And in that case, I immediately called the ombuds officer and spilled out this story where I'm leaving a voicemail that I'm very conscious of sounds like a Bigfoot sighting. Like, it sounds so crazy. And so the woman very nicely called me back, and I sort of went through, and I, like, with all my documentation, and again, I keep saying to her, like, I know it sounds crazy. And so she intervened and took care of, and sort of got all the charges removed.
Gosh.
Had sort of inferred that this would be taken care of. And the chair then, at the end of the academic year, was no longer the chair. And so I felt like that it was one of those things, I felt like that had all gone, like, it is one of those bizarre things that just sort of was like, okay, that ended. And at this point, I was like, I am not even going to attempt to try and get my MFA anymore. I don't care about the degree. I am done.
And you were only doing it so you could talk to Columbia students without feeling weird.
Yes, I know. Yes. And so it is one of those things. And so it's funny. So I thought, like, it was one of the things, like, okay, boy, do I have a bonkers story for you. But after I tweeted that, my DMs filled with people who had, like, very similar things, not from Columbia, but other different well-respected schools, where, everything from versions of, as soon as I landed, my agent, my professors emailed me to say that I kind of owed them, and that they should send their script to their agents, to payments where you're expected to pay thousands of dollars so we can get your script in front of a studio executive or a bigwig agent. And so it was this, for me at least, was this shocking window into the sort of black market economy of people trying to leverage students for either financial gain or for their own career path.
It's interesting. So I did not have as kind of creepy of an experience as you. I ended up actually co-writing my first ever script that I got paid for, like a couple $1,000s or something, with a professor of mine at school, which, like, felt very strange to me. It, like, felt kind of dirty, but was also, like, a really interesting learning experience that I was like, all right, I mean, this weird Chinese company is going to pay me $2,000 to co-write with him. Great. But speaking to, like, the last thing you said about just kind of wanting to suck as much money out of students as possible, one thing that Boston University did was at the end of our MFA, we had to pay an additional fee. We didn't have to, but they strongly encourage you to pay an additional fee to then ship us out to Los Angeles, where they set us up at Park La Brea. Well, we paid for it. And then we did classes with a TV writer. And then they hooked us up with internships around town, which was like great. Like, okay, this to me felt like a job path that I understood. But the teacher was someone who had not been writing in the business for decades, and he's still teaching there, and he does not understand the business currently, because he's not actively in it. So he says to me recently, because I went there to do something similar to you, or to talk to students, and then also like sit in on their pitch fest that they do, and he said to me like, oh, this is just kind of something we do, but we all know that like pitching isn't important in this industry anymore. And I was like, wait, what? He's like, oh yeah, a producer told me that pitching like isn't a thing. And I'm like, that's completely false. I pitch for every single job I will ever get. But he's regurgitating this to these students who are paying them so much money to get this as their film education. And it's just such I will refrain from cussing, but it's just so frustrating that this is what it does feel like a scam. As you were saying, it's a black market in many ways.
No, it's awful. At least you should be, if you're going to be charging money, at least the advice should be good and useful, and not the opposite of that.
Yeah. And when I reached out to Boston University to just make them aware that the students were not being taught properly anything that will help them with their career, and actually being taught things that will sort of hinder their process, I got a response that was like, thank you, but no thank you. We don't need your advice. Who are you anyways? But they're like, let us, yeah, I'm an up and comer. Let us know when you have a studio movie and then we'll talk, was kind of what the email was about. And I'm like, well, then that clearly shows you don't understand the business if you think that's the only measure of success.
That's crazy.
Very bizarre.
It does make you wonder what the value of that is. And I think also to some extent, if there's one thing I could sort of get people in, that if you're on one of these programs, I think you do learn a lot more by doing it. Yeah. I mean, I think that like just listening to your open writing assignment podcast with your year of 12 pitches, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like if there was a class in how to pitch, if Boston University offered a class in how to pitch, do you think you would have learned, even if it was a really good teacher, do you think you would have learned as much from like taking one class in pitching as you did as doing 12 of them?
Absolutely not. But oh my God, if I had had a pitching class even at all, if they had even mentioned pitching in those 2 years that I was there, oh God, I would have heard angels singing. No, obviously not. You learn by doing. But I think, their job is still to set you up for as much success as possible. And I didn't even have a business for film industry class at BU. They did not. It was all about the craft. You are an artiste and that's who you are. And that does not prepare you for actually having a career. And so I came out and was just like swimming with sharks and did not know how to keep afloat. And it was terrifying. And so, I mean, that to me is the biggest failing of the film industry is like pitching, not having those kinds of practical classes. But for you, just in your experience with film schools in general, what do they least prepare you for in the industry?
I think one of the things that what they didn't quite prepare was that the amount of work you need to be generating as a professional working, whether you're a writer or director. And that a lot of these things, I think the program is based where it almost feels like the Matrix, where we're just going to download into your head and suddenly Kung Fu. And like, as opposed to, you had a script, and it largely is because it's the number of students in the program and such, but like I remember we had like 5 weeks to generate the next 20 pages of our script, whereas as a working professional, like, no, like you have a week to write a full television script.
Yeah.
And I feel like that in some ways, that's the one thing that they could be doing. If someone asked me to design a program right now, I would treat it much more like, okay, every day you're writing, 5 pages, every day you're directing something, or every day, just so you get the amount of volume that as a work. And I get, if you're just starting out, you're probably not capable of working at that speed. But I think that's one thing these programs don't prepare you for, is that you're not given that amount of time to turn in a script they need to be cranking up the volume as far as what the work you're doing.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point that I have never really expected film school to do, so never faulted them for. But 100%, that is absolutely something I see in writers who are struggling to have a career is their inability to manage their time and that they can have multiple projects going and turning things in quickly and at the right pace to I think have their career grow and flourish at the right pace. And something that happened in my program was we were meant to, they're like, you have to graduate with 2 scripts, no less. It has to be 2 features or we will fail you and you won't graduate. I was like, oh my God, I got to get my 2 scripts. And I turned them in and they were like, yeah, you kind of don't have to. And other people turned in half of one script and they still graduated. And I was like, what? So that was my program.
No, and that is like they would. Yeah, I mean, there was one guy I knew who I had been 3 screening classes with him. He never finished a script, and then like afterwards, I found out like was now teaching screenwriting, and it was like, whoa. But I think that's where it's hard because I do think that the academic model weirdly isn't a good model, even though obviously it's an academic program. That I think it needs to be thought of a little bit maybe more, not a perfect metaphor, but athletics, like it's developing muscles.
I always tell Tosh, I'm like, writing is a sport. It is a sport. It is, treat it like a sport.
You just get better and faster, and it's also one of those things where I think the reason I also like the sports analogy is because nobody assumes that they can clear a 20-foot high jump, or I don't even know what that, like nobody thinks they can do that from like the get-go, or like nobody walks up to a hospital and says, I have an idea for open heart surgery, can I try? Yet so many people think with writing that they can, at their first time out, write an incredible script. And so I think a lot of times they get demoralized when you say what I've discovered through like, oh, my wife's best friend's dentist has this script and we read it. And when I don't say it's the best script I've ever read, I've given it to my agents. My agents are on the phone with Paramount right now, and we're trying to decide which Chris to attach. You know, when you don't get that response, they get totally demoralized and sometimes angry, like it's my fault. But I do think if people sort of saw it more in the sports or singing analogy, that they saw it as something that where you had to be constantly sort of working at it, and maybe you can't bench press 250 pounds right now, but if you start at 50 and every week add another 10 pounds, before you know it, you'll be there.
That is actually so beautiful, James, because I agree that the film school does teach you are an artiste and genius will hit you and your script will be amazing, or it won't because you don't have talent. But that's not been our experience, and that's why we have this podcast, is to talk about how difficult it is, the slog, and how much work you actually have to put into it to have something that someone will want to sell to Paramount. That's a really insightful, I think, observation about film school.
But it takes a tremendous amount of discipline, and that's also what's hard. Like, I don't want to do that.
I feel like this is all leading up to probably the final question, like the big question. Do we all recommend film school?
Well, I have a positive, I think, that film school taught me. Because I went to undergrad for English and history, I didn't have a film school education. And yes, could I have left and just done it on my own? Yes, that would have been very hard to also pay the bills and do that. So I went to school instead full time. And that did teach me so many things about film studies and film theory that I didn't get otherwise. And it did teach me some really interesting ways of looking at screenwriting and the craft that I wouldn't have had otherwise because I had really quirky professors. So all of that was very, very valuable. Would I have paid $80,000 to do that if I, was doing it right now? No, I would not. So I would not recommend a film school at the end of the day. But there are some positives if you just have that money lying around.
Which also I feel a little bit, because I used to say like, well, if you have a ton of money, and I've kind of now reevaluated that because I feel like that's sort of gross too. That sort of feels like it's like, well, but I do. I mean, if we're going to say positives,
let's try and end with some positives.
I think one thing they do is they do assemble a group of like-minded people who all have similar goals. And so my big chicken and egg conundrum is, I did meet my writing partner, and he's from Georgia. So the likelihood of me meeting him outside of that, and maybe I could have met a different writing partner, a better writing partner. I don't know.
Ooh, ouch.
I'm kidding. I'm
Ouch,
kidding.
Chad.
I'm kidding. Um,
You're out, Chad.
but that magic did happen, and I
Yeah.
think that we sort of did form a great partnership, and so I do think that that can happen in the best case scenarios. But also, given the cost, I kind of wonder, could this just be an app? Like we all punch in our zip code,
Oh
and
my gosh.
and you get assigned 10 people, because that
Yeah.
you do want that camaraderie, and you can help each other. I mean, like in theory, like if we were all sort of in the same program together, and Tasha, you want to be a director, Josh, you want to be a writer, I want to be a cinematographer. In theory, we could all be working together
Mhm.
to try and generate some projects to get things going. Whereas if you're just kind of on your own, it's hard to basically call up a bunch of friends and say, will you act in this film, or will you be a grip, or will you spend all night holding a boom pole?
It does take a lot more time and effort to build a network if you're just coming out to LA, but people do all the time. So it is realistically weighing the money you would pay to have sort of a shortcut to that network versus coming out here, having to work every day at a job, maybe start as an intern, whatever it is, and build up that network from scratch. So those are two things to keep in mind.
Yeah.
It's so hard. It's so hard, James. Like if your kids said they wanted to go to film school, would you be like, "No, we're not doing that?" Or would you be like, "Okay, go find yourself."
No, I think so. Well, I think also a big difference is now so many resources are online. I
Yeah.
mean, this podcast, for example, but even just like little things, like I was watching, and I don't necessarily recommend this, but like I mean, like my wife has signed me up for masterclass, and
Yes.
so I felt like it's been 8 months. I should watch one, and so I watched the James Cameron one. And so it was one of those things where 80% of it's whatever, like it's not very helpful, whatever. But he has two sections where he breaks down two scenes, in one scene in Terminator, one scene in Aliens, and it's like the best film school. Like, I mean, the way he talks about what the
Mm,
psychological effect of this shot, why I did this, and I think you can find. I mean, it's sort of a shame that DVD audio commentaries have gone away, because I felt
I
like those
know.
were also great film school. But I feel
100%.
like there's enough resources now that maybe, and you can choose. You can say, okay, I want to listen to a podcast from people who actually know what they're talking about, as opposed to hoping this professor who doesn't seem to be know what they're talking. You can sort of pick and choose, and decide who you want to be the authorities.
Yeah.
But it takes more discipline. That's the downside.
Yeah.
And I'm lazy.
Yeah. That is actually the advice I do give people is if you are disciplined and you have it in yourself to do that, charge forward on your own. But if you need, and I was kind of the person who needed structure, like you kind of talked about, almost like needing this little cushion before you go out into the world. I think I did need film school, to be honest, and I'm glad I did it in some ways. But would I recommend it? My answer is no.
I'm gonna go with no. How about you, Josh?
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm just kidding. I'm also
Someone needs
I'm
to say
also
yes.
I'm also probably in the no camp, but it is invaluable to go and, like you were saying, be around like-minded people and be around these people who are like a little crazy and think you can create these things. Like you need that in your life, because if you're around people who are like, no, you don't write movies, don't do this, get a business degree or this and that,
Mhm.
and it just takes its toll on you. So I feel like you need that environment of that 18, 19-year-old kind of like optimism of like, hey, I'm about to fucking make Star Wars. And someone's
Yeah,
like, yeah, you
yeah.
are.
It's
So
it
yeah.
no, and it's you need people to also be kind of pushing you creatively. I think
Yeah.
there's nothing better than when you would read somebody else's thing and be like, I mean, it okay, it sucks in some ways, but it's also like, oh, you want someone to be kind of pushing you forward
Yeah,
Oh, totally.
and making you better, and I think that there is something to be said for that.
I agree.
But maybe it could be an app.
Yeah.
Like I almost
Maybe.
want there to be
Or we
a
just do a master class.
yes, or just pay someone to say you have to do this each week. Like you,
Yeah.
something terrible will happen if you don't turn those pages in, or if you don't.
Josh actually wanted to create an app where you could get someone to come to your house and kick you in the balls if you didn't finish your screenplay.
I,
So
I, I would sign up for that.
Yeah. It'd be like, hey James, did you get your pages done? You're like, oh shit, no. You're like, you're a piece of shit, and then they just leave.
Yes,
It's like, oh
yes.
my god.
I personally, I respond to shame so much that would be motivating. Like that
You and
would
I are very
absolutely.
similar. Yeah, when she gives me notes, I'm like, I don't want any good. Don't give me any positives. Just tell me what I did poorly here. Just go. And she's like, okay.
He ignores all of my, this was great.
Shame me.
Oh, I know. It's like yeah, of course. You're like, well, you're just saying that to be nice.
Yeah, totally.
I assume every negative note is completely sincere and every positive note is utterly insincere. And I've never been able to train my brain to think otherwise.
Well, yeah, obviously. I think you're right.
Did we do it?
I think we did it. I think we did it. Is there anything else, James, you want to tell people about the film school experience? Either warnings or
I would,
Or
okay,
wrap
so
up?
because I do genuinely feel bad because immediately it didn't occur to, because also I didn't know that was going to viral. But
Yeah.
once it didn't occur to me that there are 200 students currently in that program that I sort of dumped gasoline on a bad situation.
Mm.
And I'd heard from one of the students that were like, I guess we take Columbia off our resume. And I was like, no,
Yeah.
if you are deciding to go that route, really look at who the instructors are, ask pointed questions. There's questions I never even thought to ask, which is what is the success rate out of this program?
Yeah.
Like don't be intimidated to say, who will I be getting instruction from? Look them up if you feel. It's also possible they don't need to be Steven Spielberg to be a worthwhile instructor, but at least you want to sort of value to check and to make sure that there's somebody who would know what they're saying, and you can then make a decision whether it's worth the cost. So I think it's nothing against that of you can ask those uncomfortable questions.
Yeah. Which leads me to think, what do we say to people who are already at Columbia or already at Boston University, who are already taking these classes and they're in it now and they want to make the best of their program? And don't laugh, I'm serious, because
I know,
I feel like
bad.
I would want to know, what are the questions I should be asking? What are the programs I should be demanding? Extracurricular things. Like what do you think those might be, James? I have some ideas.
I mean, I think one is to, if you are, I mean, because the so much of it, even in the best case scenario, is what you bring to it. So I do think if I were currently a student, I would say is like, okay, you need to be turning out a feature or a television pilot at a much faster clip. Just be writing. Just use the program to the best of you can, but generate your own work at a faster pace than the program is demanding you do it. And also if you can be more choosy about the professors that you have, that's great too. But I think that at this point, it's like you need to suck the program dry of everything you can get out of it at this point. But it really needs to be, you cannot be passive about it. You can't assume that they're going to give you anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it means also then looking ahead to making your own contacts. If there are, I mean, like I'm open to talking to anyone. And I think that it never occurred to me like, oh, let me reach out to even try. Like Catherine Bigelow had gone to Columbia years. Like, I don't think Catherine Bigelow is going to take my phone call, but I never tried.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think trying to look at your group of friends, look at who the people that are like-minded, and kind of make a little bit of a pact that we're all going to do this together and we're all going to help each other out. We're going to utilize our own sets of skills to create a ladder to, if one of us can be successful, the next can help pull the next one up.
Yeah, that's great advice. I too would add, network as much as possible, because that is something great that especially places like Columbia and Boston universities, film schools have a great resource there that you don't have if you just move to LA yourself. So definitely, for Boston University, something they did was gave us a list of all of their former students who are now, like you said, they're running CBS studios or whatever. Reach out to them, because actually particularly when you're in school, they're willing to at least receive an email from you, and just completely take advantage of that. I was very shy and I did not do that. Highly recommend. And also, I think, talk to your program directors, ask them for these classes that we're talking about, for pitching, for industry classes, ask if they can create panels or something. If you are aware of what you need, you can address that with them and just try to build that out, if they don't already have that.
No, that's great, because I do think, they don't think like, oh yeah, almost anyone's willing to talk in sort of be, kind of a font of wisdom. And I think just as also with the networking, I think that sometimes people think that's just networking up. but network laterally, network down. I mean, in my case,
Mm-hmm.
it literally was because also people that are like, there's a difference between me asking an assistant to read your script as opposed to saying, can you give this to your boss? Like,
Mm-hmm.
there's that the one will probably could result in something positive, whereas the other is just dismiss it. And looking and noticing, an assistant to a producer probably also doesn't want to be an assistant anymore, and so they're also looking for a project that will raise their stock. And so I think that too many people do think of like, oh, I have to go talk to somebody who's this bigwig.
You're right. You're right. Absolutely.
That's such great advice.
So can I just ask one question? Where is the banana person now? Have you looked them
That is
up?
such a good question. No, I've not looked them up. I will try and do that after this to see where. I mean, they like video class in particular is training them to do like museum installments, like art museum installments. So I think they all became just kind of arty boho people in the Bay Area.
But if you're the banana woman, please reach out.
Please reach out. I would love to know what your journey has been.
We want you on the podcast, please.
All right. I am going to wrap up with a quote of the day. But before I do that, James, thank you so much for spending an hour and a half with us.
No, I'm sorry. I'm long-winded. So
no, this was great. It was really great to talk to you about this subject. All right. Quote of the day. Super apt. Very depressing. We don't need books to make films. It's the last thing we want. It turns cinema into the bastard art of illustration. Peter Greenaway. Please remember to rate and subscribe. Follow us at Act2. Josh loves when I give negative quotes of the day. Follow us at ActTwoWriters for more awesome writing stuff. You can follow me, Tasha, at Story Thursday on Instagram or on Twitter at Tasha 3.0.
Or me on Instagram as Josh Hallman or Twitter at Joshua Hallman. And James, we already know, but where can we find you? If you want to tell us.
I'm only on Twitter. I may be deleting my account, but JSTOTERAUX at so first initial last name at Twitter or whatever. That's just that. Sorry, I clearly don't know any of these things.
No.
But thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Absolutely. I'm so glad. As always, the Act 2 podcast is a production of Act 2, a network and support group for the everyday working screenwriter. This episode was edited by Paul Lundquist, music by 414 Bag, which you can find on Spotify.